from your perspective, what are you seeing in the market in your conversations with practitioners and vendors and so on?
In my opinion, the volume piece of it is probably the most visible, like when we talk about this stuff, but there's a couple of things like compounding all at the same time. There's more code, but there's also faster cycle times happening.
How do you view that space, like, in terms of when I look at AI and AppSec?
It has been probably the big rock of my research agenda this year has been in this area. I have probably in June, early July, I have kind of two big reports coming out in this space.
Do you think the framing is accurate, hyperbolic, somewhere in between? And where do you think organizations are feeling that pain most acutely?
I just feel like we have a habit of, as an industry, not just security, technology in general, of like using these terms for marketing momentum more than necessarily like analytical clarity.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Katie Norton. Thanks for being on again, Katie.
Hi,
Katie.
happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. It's been a while since we've had you on, I think about a year or so. Yeah. And it doesn't sound really long until you think about how quickly and how much has changed in the world of, application security, software development, and all therein in a year. But for folks that don't know you, don't follow your team, can you tell us a bit about yourself as well as your role?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. Katie Norton. I am a senior research manager at IDC. And I think first for folks, if you're not in like product management, you probably don't know what an industry analyst is. But basically my job is to research technology markets, how they're structured, who the players are, where they're heading, and also how organizations are like buying and using technology. So I speak to both enterprise buyers, CISOs, their teams, and also I, talk to vendors and the folks that are developing the tech too. And so IDC itself, right, is one of the larger global analyst firms, and within there I basically lead our program covering DevSecOps, application security, software supply chain security. So I cover kind of the whole gamut. I usually throw it as that I come at it from the development perspective. So I'm just always looking at how does software development and security intersect in the day-to-day. So
yeah, I think it's a good way to come at it because, from security, we often think about it from our perspective, but I think framing it from the developer's perspective lets you probably understand the trends a little bit better because we tend to follow where the developers go, right? The tools change, the techniques, the methodologies, the code volume, all those type of things. And kind of keeping an idea, a pulse on that helps you keep a pulse on where security is headed now or should be going, right? Kind of takes me to my first question for you. So since we last chatted, AI-assisted and agentic coding tools, whether it's Cursor, Claude Code, GitHub Copilot, and others, they've dramatically accelerated the volume of code being produced. From your perspective, what are you seeing in the market in your conversations with practitioners and vendors and so on? Like, how is it changing application security, workloads, and the risk profiles and all those type of activities?
This is an area I've done a lot of writing and research in this last probably 6 months in particular. I think, in my opinion, the volume piece of it is probably the most visible, like when we talk about this stuff, but there's a couple of things like compounding all at the same time. There's more code, but there's also faster cycle times happening. And I think a meaningful share of code is now just being authored by non-humans. And so I had a research report published, I think back in October, but it was about understanding and managing the risks of AI-assisted development, and some of the data from IDC's research that we have put together includes that AI coding assistance we see is almost universally adopted at the organizational level at this point. I think in my last survey, which admittedly was a little dated, I think I ran that about a year ago now, so I would expect this number to be even higher. But in that survey, roughly half of developers at an average enterprise said they were using an AI coding tool, and those same developers attributed about basically like 2 out of every 5 lines of their code to AI generation, roughly a little over 40%. And that I think one of the most consequential things is that developers are accepting almost 40% of that without revision, according, to our surveys. So that's a lot going in that is not being reviewed by a human. And, the back half of your question, like how is that changing the AppSec workload, the risk profile? Obviously code's being committed faster, but reviews are shorter. And I think the window for catching issues before they ship is a lot narrower than it used to be. And also LLMs, they're still they produce insecure code. I think there's a ton of academic and industry research proving this. We've advanced a lot into how to interject security into that process, but at a base level, generally, the AI coding tools aren't producing, secure code out the box. And then the other thing, which I think is actually super relevant, I was reading a little bit before this with the research on like the GitHub stuff that happened just, I think, yesterday or the day before. I think a part of that report is how these coding tools are now a component, I think, of the supply chain in their own right. I think, developer tool security, the developer endpoint, like I've been talking about that as a supply chain concern since like 2023, and most people, I felt like I was shouting into the void with that for the most part, but I feel like it's starting to get its airtime now, rightfully so, because now with all of these agents operating on developer laptops, the agents themselves as well as the endpoint becomes a huge attack vector. So yeah, those are kind of a lot of the things I'm following. It I think really when you like boil it down in terms of like AppSec, that like AppSec teams are being asked to secure a development process that's like fundamentally changed, and the tools, the workflows, how teams are working with a process and tools that were designed for a slower, more human-paced model. I think the security market's starting to catch up, and there's a lot more out there, but that it requires change, right, as an organization to like figure out what are the tools that I need now to secure these things, and then how do I implement them fast enough? Yeah,
safe to say there's tons and tons of change. You covered so much there. Like one is the code volume explosion. Like I think I've been writing about this too. Like GitHub hit 1 billion commits in 2025, and it was like a celebratory PR moment. And now they're projected to hit 14 billion this year. Your comment about the implicit vulnerability of AI generated code, like numbers are all over the place, but academia and industry AppSec vendors and so on have kind of documented that incredibly well due to factors like being trained on vulnerable open source and so on. The developers implicitly trusting the code that comes from AI generated coding tools, of course, because they're incentivized to move fast and get features out and speed to market and competitive dynamics and things like that. You touched on
it's not just developers either. Like in the research I did, I wrote about this thing, like the confidence risk gap, in that like the survey I ran, it was so funny. It was like, at least like when asking the security folks if they were concerned about AI coding security, really high rates, very concerned, highly concerned. But then it's like later in the survey, you ask them like how confident they are in their ability to like catch and fix issues. Super high confidence. So there's like this mismatch between like concern and confidence in a lot of organizations that I think we're probably not overly concerned, but in most cases probably a little overconfident as well.
Yeah, I've seen that come up in various surveys and reports, and it's interesting the paradigm there. And then I feel like there's going to be, not to be like a kind of a doomer about it, but I feel like there's going to be a long tail of incidents to come out of this, because like there's an overconfidence, right? And then at the same time, that more volume, more code velocity, the struggle to keep up with the pace. We've already struggled to keep up with it in terms of vulnerability backlogs and friction with developers and so on. And now you have like the collapse of exploitation timelines and the kind of industrialization, right, of vulnerability, identification, exploitation, autonomous exploitation, et cetera. And that takes me to my next question for you. Like, the term Vulnpocalypse or Bugpocalypse or whatever phrase you want to use has been gaining traction to describe like the explosion of CVEs and AI generated code, and then the widening gap between like, what we can discover versus what we can actually fix. Do you think the framing is accurate, hyperbolic, somewhere in between? And where do you think organizations are feeling that pain most acutely?
That's a good question. Very relevant. I have to be honest though, like usually I'm really skeptical of terms like this. Actually, like even as an analyst, I hate acronyms, and like I always say, I'm like, if you want a category named, I'm not your analyst, because it's like those things. I just feel like we have a habit of, as an industry, not just security, technology in general, of like using these terms for marketing momentum more than necessarily like analytical clarity. So I tend to push back on them, but I will say, I think, while the dramatization is generally unhelpful, I think the underlying dynamic of it's not made up, and I don't think it's anything that is like the central tension behind the Vulnpocalypse is like that's nothing new. I mean, CVE volumes have been climbing for years and backlogs have been growing for years. Time to patch has been a bottleneck in most organizations. I mean, practitioners that I talk with have been talking about the, prioritization fatigue, signal to noise ratio problems. I think this all happened well before AI entered the picture. AI has just changed it, right? What's I think different now is the pace, not like what the nature of the problem is. AI is sort of accelerating the dynamics that were already in motion. So, and I think you hit on a couple of things, right? On the discovery side, AI is just industrializing finding vulnerabilities. I mean, you can't go, I can't go anywhere without hearing Mythos or, any of these things nowadays. And then, but like you pointed to as well, it's changing the exploitation side as well, that the time from disclosure to, first observed exploit has been proven or demonstrated to have collapsed too over the last couple of years. And I think also another thing is AI's, I think we talk a lot about AI and costs being high, but I think opposite dynamic seems to be happening in the like exploitation area of that. I think AI is actually probably lowering the costs, or even at least lowering the skill threshold to be able to develop exploits. And I think that is part of what's contributing to this, dynamic, because just as defenders are using AI, so are the folks attacking. So, and then, to your point too, on the front end of the pipeline, you've got the AI generated code feeding more vulnerabilities on the, so basically the front end, the middle and the back, everything's moving faster at the same time. And so for organizations, right, I think I've seen the most, again, it's a continuation of what it's always been, but worse so now that it's that remediation capacity and ability that it's just even worse than it was before in terms of like humans already couldn't keep up with it. And while I think we're starting to develop the tools to also be able to, automate some of that remediation to help catch up. It's a balancing act of like getting everything moving at the same speed. And right now there's kind of, everybody's in a different lane.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think we've seen AI, to your point, the front, the middle, and the back end, like it has accelerated all these aspects of the pipeline of development, vulnerability identification, everything therein, except for remediation. Like that's the area where AI has the most potential, I think, at least in the sense of where we most desperately need to like try to figure out a new way in terms of remediation, acceleration, because it's already been the bottleneck, but now it's really exacerbated by all these things that we just touched on. And those backlogs are only going to grow more than they already have been. But of course, there's, remediation is complex. It's technical, but there's also business considerations, competing priorities, like, business context, all these type of things that are involved there. And I wanted to ask you too, you kind of joked about acronyms. For better or worse, we live in a world of acronyms, and the AppSec category has had many of these over the years, like SAST and DAST and SCA and ASPM had its day. And as you said, many of these things were built for kind of the human-paced world of development. Do you see these categories holding up or collapsing into something new or being reinvented entirely as AI, agents become both the authors and reviewers of code? And this is something I've touched on with other folks like Jack Cable, for example, and there's even emerging categories of agentic coding security management and like new categories, right, to kind of emphasize the AI-driven SDLC. But I'm curious your take on that.
Yeah, I think the way I've been framing it is I look at like SAST, DAST, SCA, ASPM, all these things as more of like primitives of AppSec than necessarily like products or labels. I don't, as things evolve, I don't think their underlying functions are what's going to change or go away. You still have to understand, is your code vulnerable? You've got to understand what's your running application doing and being able to protect it. You need to manage your dependencies. You need to be able to prioritize all of the findings across all of those tools and remediate them, right? So like, I don't think AI eliminates any of that work that has to be done. I think what changes is like where those get implemented and sort of what form factor they take, and also, AppSec's already been through multiple reinventions, like to change to keep up with CI/CD, microservices, like cloud native. So I think I look at AI as the next like forcing function, not the first one in changing AppSec. So in terms of the way those change, like a good example would be like if an AI tool is authoring code, what I'm starting to see is instead of scanning after the fact, these things are being integrated, at the point of generation, through things like, and instead of a hook in a CI/CD pipeline, it's a rules file or a skill or an MCP. So, but it's still doing the same function. It's just doing it in a different place and maybe in a slightly different way. Now we're using AI and LLMs to enhance and improve in some of these, existing, ways of looking at application security. So, and you said on like new categories, right? I mean, I do have been doing a lot of, I do think it's debatable, right? Like it goes with what I just said. We're doing kind of the same thing and where it's going. I mean, I think we're calling it, I think I've even been using like agentic development security and that kind of stuff to kind of encompass what these things are. But at the baseline, a lot of it's the same. There are some changes to the point earlier of like protecting the endpoint, specific security things with AI coding assistance like MCP, and like there's obviously some extensions of like open source, what we've done to protect those things with how developers bring in skills and plugins and MCP servers, and the like. But I think the one thing to also keep in mind, in my opinion, is that, I don't think all of this, like this, say, move to protecting and happening at the point of generation, I don't think it's changing. Like, you still have to scan after the fact. I always say, like people will say, like, scanning's dead, but I'm like, when you're, yes, I think we need to move to integrating with the coding agent, but that's only going to catch the findings on like the files you're working on at the time you're working on it. Like it's not going to be knowledgeable of like a 0 day that's happening at that exact moment of, I mean, I work with a lot of enterprises that have mainframes and legacy applications and stuff that's not actively being worked on with AI. So you still have to have that sort of passive, more like post hoc analysis too to complement it. So I wouldn't say that's entirely going away by any means, but I do think, I always say, I feel like that like scan in a CI/CD pipeline that we've considered like as like the go or no go signal in DevSecOps, I think that's sort of what will start to change as software development and DevOps and all of these other things become more agentic as well. It's just, like I said, it's the same stuff. It's just we have to like adapt to like how and where we're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a good framing. That's pretty much how I think of it in a few ways of what you said there. One is these primitives aren't going away. In fact, we're seeing AI being used as part of them for SAST, for example, to have less false positives, higher true positives, find findings that traditional static scanning tools have missed. And as an industry, like to your point, we always and maybe it's I don't want to blame the vendors, but like we tend to argue of like shift left versus ADR and CADR or like runtime, and it's like it's not one or the other, it's all of the above that you have to have as a comprehensive application security program. And then you talked about, this takes me to another topic I was curious your take on is there's the static scanning and scanning after the fact and things like that. And I feel like we're also seeing a kind of surge of innovation or at least excitement about the potential in the category of offensive security too. You look at, there's a whole slew of of startups and strategic incumbents who have raised capital, have product offerings in this space of leveraging AI agents and kind of autonomous activities, right, to innovate in the pen testing and offensive security area as well, coming from the outside in of testing systems and applications and so on. Kind of how do you view that space, like in terms of when it look at AI and AppSec?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. It has been probably the big rock of my research agenda this year has been in this area. I have probably in June, early July, I have kind of two big reports coming out in this space. I'm doing one of those MarketScape, our quadrant style evaluation on DAST. While at the same time, I'm also doing an IDC Innovators, which is kind of like highlighting early stage startups in autonomous pen testing. And I'm publishing those reports simultaneously intentionally because I think sort of we'll go to the end and then come back there is like, I think the long term is we have this umbrella of just like AI driven offensive security that all of these I always say, like, I think the long term the Venn diagram between AI driven DAST and autonomous pen testing, like there's a big overlap there, right? But yeah, so it's a really big topic for me. And actually in the past I never really researched pen testing because, again, I look at software development and security, and pen testing never happened in that like cadence, right? So it was just not something that I spent a lot of time on. But now I think that's one of the most interesting things is that doing pen testing with agents allows that to happen like at the pace of or alongside software development in a way that it never has. And really in my mind it's kind of closing a gap that's really existed for a long time. And I think they both tried to solve it one way or the other, but like human pen testing and DAST have always had complementary weaknesses and never have either side's been able to like fully cover for the other one. And I feel like to some degree the autonomous pen testing space is aiming to and trying to solve some of those problems. I think the underlying thing of it, back to cost, is that's probably one of the biggest prohibitors. I mean, a lot of the vendors I've talked to in this space are doing specific things to be able to manage that for organizations, but any of the like LLM driven tools I've seen, there's always that cost factor. Either the vendor's eating some cost because they're running it on their on their own infrastructure, or it's cost and over time that they're having to pass back to their customers. And we could spend a whole nother hour just talking about
I was going to say that's I just want to jump in there because I feel like that's a topic. We don't have to go way down the rabbit hole, but I have been thinking about this more, and because I've been seeing people talk about the end of the subsidies, right, around AI in terms of the cost of tokens and inference and things like that. And it applies, of course, in like the broader context of development and like phrases like token maxing and things like this. But of course, in cyber and AppSec too, because we're just saying, well, just use AI, and it's like, okay, but what do you do in those subsidies then? And like your costs are now becoming a consideration. Before it was like, just use AI, it's going to be cheaper than people, it offset labor, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But there's like a cost factor that's real there when the costs kind of reflect the true cost of the inference, the tokens and things like that. But yeah, just something I've been thinking about too, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most interesting things like I've been exploring in, as part of my job, I forecast the market. I also do a lot of survey research, and I'm working on my survey right now, and I am putting some questions in it around this topic exactly on like sensitivity or willingness, thoughts on, the change from like a lot of tools are having to move from like per developer or per asset pricing to consumption-based pricing. And what does that look like? And also trying to think about like, how does that impact the AppSec market and its size, all of these things we've, with Mythos and everything, everybody's saying, AppSec's dead or, and all of these things. And I'm like, I honestly think like when again, as an analyst, that my job is to like bottoms up size how big I believe the market of tools in this space is. I look at like, I'm going to be bringing in vendors like Anthropic and OpenAI and Cursor that have never been part of how I've sized the market before. And then this change from like per dev consumption-based pricing. Like you can't predict that stuff, and those, it'll be really interesting because you look back at maybe like the observability world kind of touched on this a couple of years ago when there was a lot of concerns and challenges with like changes in like surprise bills and stuff like that, and I think we see it a lot even with just like the coding tools and use of like Claude and for like work purposes, not even security. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be figured out over the next couple of years, and these tools like the autonomous pen testing or even like AI SAST and others are going to sort of test what's like acceptable in terms of price, like what's the upper limit and what becomes the norm in terms of how these things are priced.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. Last thing I'll say on that, like, is like it's the excitement of all the things we can do now with this technology that we couldn't do due to human bottlenecks and constraints and bandwidth, but we've kind of spoken about it, mostly until recently, of like as if it was all free or like the cost was trivial. And it's like, well, that may not be the case forever. And then how do you kind of account for that consideration when you do have to pay for it based on consumption? And like, there are constraints in terms of budget limits, right? And ceilings from security budgets and so on. But yeah, I'm excited and interested to see where that goes. And you also touched on this a little bit earlier with your talk about MCP and skills and such. Another thing I've been kind of keeping an eye on, and a lot of your research is, of course, about software supply chain security. We've seen tons and tons of attacks. Like it seems like every day I open LinkedIn, for example, there's a new attack on NPM or the software supply chain. And then the introduction of AI, LLMs, and agents. I feel like it's kind of changed that landscape or made it even more complex than it already was in terms of the supply chain picture. Whether it's AI generated dependencies, hallucinated packages, malicious MCP servers, malicious skills, the provenance and integrity of AI generated code. Like how do you view the software supply chain landscape? Because I feel like that's gotten even more problematic and porous than it already was.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I joke that like I haven't named a category yet, but I can hang my analyst hat on that. IDC was the first firm to define what the software supply chain was back in like 2023. And I pulled up that document and I was like, man, I really need to refresh this. And it's like on my to-do list for the next couple of months of like there's stuff that has to be added to it because, to your point, I guess I'll step back and say, I think it's both AI is both amplifying every existing risk we already had while adding some genuinely new ones on top of it. And so the one thing I've always harped on with the supply chain in my research is that as an industry, I think we've over-rotated on the like third party and open source aspect of it. Well, I say that and people are like, it is like super important, but I've always looked at the supply chain as like everything that touches your code or an application from creation all the way to delivery. Like I've always used a cereal factory as like my like analogy here. And when we talk about open source and third-party components, we're talking about like the ingredients, right, that go into the cereal. But you also have to care about like, is the machine that's forming it into the little O's and putting shards of metal into it, or is like the grocery store and the shelf that it's sitting on for people to buy it, are they like rotating the stock and putting like the oldest stuff first? So there are parallels you can draw between all of those things to parts of the software development lifecycle. And it includes too like the people in the factory and the developers and all of this stuff. So anyway, I think it's really important that we have to understand, especially lately with all of the attacks that are targeting CI/CD. While there certainly is an aspect of open source in all of those, attackers are clearly going for the infrastructure too, not just the open source that you're putting into your application. So you have to secure sort of the whole factory. And now there's a whole bunch of new machines in the factory and new parts. There's LLMs, you've got MCPs, skills, all of these things. And then also, the applications you're creating are oftentimes have AI integrated into them and have their own risks associated with them, and how how are you pulling down models from, say, like Hugging Face or wherever you're getting them from, and know that those are secure. So I think you've kind of got all of these things going on the developer workstation. So I think what I would land on is that I think we're finally getting to the point where there's this like recognition of like, oh yeah, it is like the whole thing that you need to secure. It's not just the open source components that you're pulling into your application, but in fact you need to actually like lock the doors to your factory and ensure that people can't get in because all it takes, defenders, we have to secure everything and every opportunity. An attacker only just has to find the one window you didn't lock, right? So I think all of these things matter. And I think one other thing I'll say, you asked about like how this changes in terms of like now people not writing the code, right? I think one really interesting area that I don't think is totally solved yet is like the area of provenance and like how you can trust like the idea of like who wrote it, where it came from, if it's been tampered with. I think agentic development complicates all of those things. Obviously like the who wrote it question loses meaning when the answer is like an assistant on behalf of a developer with context from a model and a set of tools it called. So I think, I feel like provenance, attestation, all of those things have probably code signing, those areas, the pipeline security stuff have always been the harder problems to solve, and AI being involved in the creation of code is making that, I think, that much worse.
Yeah, very well said. A couple of things I'll highlight that you just touched on. There is a great kind of blog from an individual named Luke Hines, who runs like No, which has kind of taken off, right, in terms of sandboxing for agents. And he had a thought-provoking piece I read. I'll send it to you after this about provenance and attestation and things like that around the agentic SDLC and like you said, models and agents, and like it gets incredibly complicated. And then also what you said there was true is like, the software supply chain, there's of course like the exacerbation of the historical aspects of it due to AI and agents and so on, the new introduction of MCP and skills and things like that. And then to your point, there's the systemic side of it, the critical kind of infrastructure, if you want to call it that we depend on, of the GitHub and NPM and the package registries and stuff. And there's only so much, right, as an organization that you can control of these kind of providers or these entities in the ecosystem. So it's kind of on them, right, to secure. A rising tide lifts all ships kind of mantra, right? In that way that so many people depend on these things. So they have an opportunity to really make a big impact for better or for worse from a security perspective. So it's all complicated, but it's all interesting as well. I wanted to ask you about the workforce angle of this a little bit. We've talked a lot about the tools, the methodologies, the trends. When you look at the AppSec team of the near future, are we talking about smaller teams augmented by agents, more teams amplified by agents, new roles like AI security engineer or agent governance lead, or a fundamentally different operating model entirely? How do you think about the workforce?
I think the gut instinct, or what most people hear in the news, right, is like AI equals layoffs and smaller teams and less people. I think this is probably one of the hardest areas, like, to look in the crystal ball at as an analyst, for sure. Like, there's some things I feel very, very confident in. This is one area I feel less so, but I think the way I look at it is most AppSec, I think the idea that agents and AI are going to reduce headcount like misreads where most AppSec teams, like, what headcount is there to reduce? I mean, most organizations are already stretched in that domain in particular. I think we'll see more of that. AI sort of redirects or like shifts where humans add the most value, not to necessarily reduce like the amount or the function. So, the things like the roles, the responsibilities, the skills required to do jobs, I think are going to change, right? Like to be successful in AppSec, I think it's going to require probably much more engineering leaning skills in terms and native AI usage and being comfortable with all of those things. And then, I think it's the stuff like the lower level work, executing a scan, like going through individual findings, figuring, chasing down if something's a false positive, like some of that stuff, like the work doesn't go away. I just think more AI is going to help there. And then where humans are, we love the term human in the loop or on the loop. I think the shift has to be to think like systems thinking, how to govern how code's produced, deciding where when we were talking about how form factors, the primitives don't change, but where and how they get implemented does. People have to think through that for their own particular organization, right? Like how and where those security checkpoints belong, building those integrations between, the security tools and the development tools, setting policy, policies that much more important than it has ever been because while I've certainly seen some examples of agents going rogue and not following policy, they're probably more likely than humans to do what they're supposed to do, right? So it's very much, actually, I was like, I think Dan at Chainguard wrote a blog about how it's like bumper bowling and that you need to, you have to have these rails that just guide the ball right to the strike, right? And that's that clicked for me very much. Shout out to Dan there on how organizations need to think about policy, right? So I think what the AppSec team from 5 years ago and 5 years in the future is going to look like is going to be different, but I don't think it's size is the part that changes. I think it's skills and responsibilities will change, and maybe with that will come titles. That certainly there could be more. We see a lot of that, like AI in front of things, and but definitely in the job descriptions, you're going to see a lot more requirements for being comfortable with using all of the AI native security tooling.
Yeah, I agree with most of everything you said there. First off, I love the analogies too, and of course, the guardrails and the system prompts and things like these aren't entirely perfect security controls, but they will be an incredibly important part of the dynamic, especially as we kind of relinquish control to agents and to models to kind of accelerate different AppSec activities, right? Those kind of guardrails become even more important. And then, I think to your point, it's not going to look the same across every organization. And to your the head count comment, the number always varies. It's 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. AppSec engineers have always been outnumbered exponentially by developers. And you now throw in the more volume, the more velocity of code and all that kind of stuff. I don't think there's an opportunity to kind of cut the AppSec team. If anything, they become even more critical, in my opinion. I was going to ask you too, there's so much that we've just covered across people, process, technology, that kind of thing they're in. CISOs and security leaders are listening to this and trying to figure out what to prioritize right now. And I know it's not going to look the same for every organization. They're all unique and different, have unique, business considerations and such. But what do you think will separate, organizations that thrive in the agentic SDLC era versus the ones that kind of either fall behind or fall further behind?
I think there's a couple of things I would touch on here. One is, I'll close the loop on what we've touched on in a couple of places, right? I think investing in the developer environment as a security domain is like top order. The things like developer workstation, the IDE, the extensions, all of those things, and the credentials and things like I've read about stuff with developers have secrets on their laptops that agents can access. And anyway, I think that has always been an IT concern. It needs to be also a security concern, and I think a lot of the recent attacks are helping elevate that. But yeah, I really think that in most organizations it's been AppSec owns the code, endpoint maybe would be the laptop, and security and identity might have the credentials. It's nobody thinks about the development environment as an entire system and how to secure that. And so I think more organizations, the ones that are going to be able to adopt AI coding and get the benefits from, IDC's done, my colleague that covers Gen AI and AI development. I mean, the benefits that developers and organizations get from leveraging these tools is real, but you have to be able to do it securely. So, thinking about that development environment as a system. And then I would, on the flip side to kind of where we were just talking, was I think investing in that human in the loop, being the right human, and not even just skills, but I think a lot of AI governance discussions assume that like human oversight is the human or is the safety mechanism. But I think it's, a lot of times that's usually just a developer accepted a suggestion. That's not oversight, in my opinion. That's just the same person making the same decision at a like faster pace. I think organizations that do well in the coming months and years are gonna figure out what the like meaningful human checkpoints are, and that is probably not at every line of code or every PR. It's more likely going to be shifting to some of those things we're talking about, like the architectural decisions, the trust boundaries, the autonomy thresholds for agents, investing in those places where human judgment has the real effect and allows to these tools to do the things that they do well safely. I think is a real, like, that's a real strategy shift, because right now it's just like, oh, as long as the person hits yes, that's we're good. Like, that's human in the loop. And I'm like, I back to my data point that like 40% goes of like AI suggestions just go unreviewed. I mean, clicking that yes does not guarantee that human did any sort of evaluation of what's being presented to them. So those are two things I would advise folks to think about that are maybe a little outside of the box.
Yeah, I wrote a piece, not to kind of promote here, but I wrote a piece called "The Human in the Loop Illusion" maybe a month or two ago, because there was data coming out of Anthropic and others showing that people are just dangerously skip permissions, all those kind of things, like just implicitly trusting and clicking approve, or they don't even want to click approve. And as they start to use these tools more, they start to kind of implicitly just trust the output more without reviewing it. So I think that human in the loop, while it feels good to say, in practice, I don't think it's often, being done with much rigor or much analysis. So I guess the last question for you here. I know predictions are hard and like, of course, but you talked about, your job, of course, is watching the industry, where it's headed, forecasting, things like that, looking out, say, 18, 24 months, given all the things you're kind of watching and keeping an eye on. What would be your boldest prediction for AppSec and software supply chain security and the broader SDLC in terms of how it may change and what it will look like? And what are some things you're kind of keeping an eye on to kind of either validate or invalidate that, view?
I'll be super bold here, and because I've been wrestling with this myself, over the last couple of months, and I guess I'll just put it out there that I'm like, I don't think DevSecOps as we've practiced or conceptualized it for the last decade survives. I don't know on the timeline. I can't put timelines to anything anymore, but we can say 24 months. And I won't say DevSecOps is dying, but that I think it's being made to some degree architecturally like unnecessary because of who's writing the code. Like, in my mind, DevSecOps was an answer to a very specific problem. Like, security could not keep up with development velocity. Security and development didn't work together, so they had to be embedded in that workflow, right? And that model was built on the assumption that the developer was the integration point for security, right? And now if the agent becomes the primary author of code, I think that there's some logic there that gets disrupted. And, as our security teams can integrate security itself directly with the agent, and that, I think that also gets them back some operational autonomy that they didn't have, not by going back to being like a gatekeeper necessarily, but having like their own sort of agent-based execution layer that closes its own loop. I almost see it's like, there's always in both software development and security this pendulum that often swings back and forth, and I've watched it on the DevOps side from like waterfall to DevOps, and then we landed sort of on platform engineering somewhere in the middle here, and now that's changing a little bit with agents as well. And I see the same kind of thing with security, in that it's not that these teams don't need to work together, but it's more like the developers' agents my agents talk to your agents, right? I think it's sort of, again, this idea of like the form factors changing. So while I don't think like the cultural goals of DevSecOps, like that those don't persist, I think, that things like collaboration and doing security earlier and shift left, if you will, like that stuff I think still persists, but it's this idea of like that developer, like the developer is the like I said, the integration point for security changes. But on the positive side, where I'll say, because people sometimes react negatively to this thought, I think the criticism of DevSecOps has always been that like the outcomes are really aspirational, but like in actual practice, it's still, I mean, the data and the research I see, it's still not, we're 15 years into this concept, and I think overall they've generally fell short for a lot of organizations. And I think actually with AI and agents, we can get towards what the outcomes of DevSecOps we're like actually reaching for, where security is actually embedded and runs at the pace of software development. That becomes closer to being achievable than we were ever able to do it with like the natural, or the flaws of how humans have to interact with each other and their human, less automated processes. So yeah,
as you were saying that, like literally what I was thinking is like the principles or the objective of injecting security earlier in the SDLC and like mitigating risks and things like that, I think those are still super valid. But it's ironic because I think by the human, because what DevSecOps traditionally required was like this tight collaboration and kumbaya between development and security, and we were going to work together and have this great, symbiotic working relationship. But I think with the humans kind of not being as in the loop, I guess you could say, like, developers are kind of giving more control to the agents and the models in terms of writing the code. We also have the opportunity to kind of inject security in more technically rather than culturally into the things that we talked about, the rules, configurations, the guardrails, the automation. It could get us closer, I think, to that DevSecOps kind of panacea that we were chasing, given it's more technical than cultural at this point. We can kind of use the technology to kind of make it happen versus just needing like, security champion programs and trying to go out there and get people to care or get involved. So I think, I agree with that.
I think there's an opportunity for security folks here, because we often, I mean, in general, when we talk about DevSecOps, we always over talk about the developer side of things, right? That like developers don't care about security and blah, blah, blah. But it's like equally, I think it's challenging for security folks to understand development and engineering. And so I think AI also brings the opportunity for some of their work to be in a little bit more closed of a loop. I think about, is it possible as AI improves in the future that security folks can like close the loop on, say, the low and, the non-critical, a misconfiguration, a secret, some of these things that like where they can pass the context to an agent themselves that, well, maybe there is the DevSecOps agent that works between the two teams, right? And that has access to the code and access to the, security functions and whatnot. But that I think it allow both, to some degree, a positive separation of concerns, and that developers can focus on developing and creating and making apps and features and agents and do so securely. And then security folks can ensure that, everything is all the other things we have to care about beyond just like the code, right? Is getting taken care of and being able to, close some of those gaps maybe a little bit, more autonomously than less reliant on engineering than they have. I think those two teams, no matter what, will always have to, there's no way to like not have all teams involved with security these days, like identity, the SOC, the AppSec developers, like there has to be collaboration and visibility between all of these areas with how complicated attacks and security are these days. But yeah, it's interesting to think about some of the ways we've always, you have to be willing, I think, like I always say there's such a psychological aspect to this job, to security, and you have to be able to get beyond some of that, like, this is the way we've always done it mentality, and be willing to sort of lean into what the future could be.
It's so funny. I'm going to end us there, but, I had given a talk at the SANS AI Security Summit in DC in March, and I kind of talked about the systemic problem in security that we're a laggard or a late adopter by nature, and like thinking of the crossing the chasm kind of terminology, and we need to pivot to being an early adopter and an innovator with this technology so we don't miss the wave like we did with cloud and mobile and SaaS DAST and all the others before it, and you just kind of epitomized that with what you said there of, the complacency culture, the way we've always done it, kind of mindset in security that's often there, especially in large enterprises, I'll say. So Katie, thanks so much for jumping on. I know I didn't disagree with a lot of what you said, but I couldn't. The way you're thinking about it is the way I'm thinking about it. And I appreciate all the research and stuff you put out there, as well as the broader IDC team. So thank you so much for jumping on with me today.
Yeah, all those people tuning in to watch us fight were disappointed.
Yes, thoroughly. All right, thank you so much
for having me. I always enjoy getting to talk to you, Chris.
All right, take care.
Awesome. Bye.